In this last video about World War II, we're going to talk about the Holocaust, the devastation of the war, and some of the new technologies that went along with it. Eugenics programs. By the 1920s and 30s, Western science had discovered human genetics. While the knowledge of genetics can be useful and beneficial, some groups and governments began to use that knowledge in very controversial ways. In many cases, the use of genetics by governments in the early 20th century were influenced by social Darwinism and bent on improving the genetics of a group of people or a society as a whole. And hopefully you remember social Darwinism and how people use that as a reason for imperialism and so forth. What started as a quest to improve the human species soon took a darker turn as Nazi scientists and Nazi governments began to force people to get sterilized, meaning some people would not be able to reproduce and have children. In order to fulfill Hitler's pro-German worldview, the Nazis felt they had to rid humans of things they saw as illnesses, which could include anything from physical and mental handicaps to people that were criminals, and even people that were gay. So this is something that the Nazis saw as wrong, and therefore they thought it was, genetic, something that if you were to stop these groups of people from reproducing, that it would stop. As a result, Nazi governments began to sterilize these groups, posing the moral question, does anyone have the right to deny others to reproduction? So a little bit about pan-Germanism. The Nazis did not begin their quest of extermination until 3 years into World War II. They started at first with far less violent methods. We talked about the Nuremberg laws and how those slowly stripped the rights away of their citizens. Initially, Nazi Germany encouraged the immigration of non-Germans, specifically Jewish people, and wanted them to leave and move to other countries. And then, if they were still there, are passing laws like the Nuremberg laws that we discussed earlier. They also condoned events such as the Night of Broken Glass or Kristallnacht, which is basically not necessarily by the government, but probably by some of Hitler's secret police force and citizens that basically went around terrorizing Jewish people in the community, vandalizing storefronts and raiding, taking everything out, stealing from them, burning down synagogues, which is why it translates into Night of the Broken Glass. To promote the German race, the Nazis began fertilization programs and awards to German mothers who had large amounts of children. Mussolini did the same thing in Italy and would literally give gold medals to mothers and fathers that produced so many children. They also set up the same policies in Germanic, other areas they saw as German that were later conquered, including Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Czech regions. So the reason we know about so much that Hitler did kind of a lot sooner than we knew about the things Stalin was doing is because Hitler is going to put his policies into place not only in Germany, but all of the conquered territories as well. That brings us to talking about the Holocaust. And I'm sure, we're not going to talk about in too much detail in this video, as hopefully we've all heard of this and know what this is before. So when Hitler first came to power and began persecuting the Jews, it didn't start as a mass extermination attempt as what the Holocaust was. Initially, the Nazis wanted to just get rid of the Jews and other people they saw as inferior to other places. There was even a talk about moving them to the African country of Madagascar, but they were trying to come up with logical ways to get rid of this group of people. Once the war was underway and the amounts of non-Germans under Nazi control became much higher because of all of the area they were conquering, they realized they weren't able to get all of these people out of the places they controlled. So this is when it was violent the whole time, but this is when it turns from, violence and persecution to an extermination attempt. The governments of Italy, Romania, and the others you see there, I have in there cooperated willingly. Willingly should probably be in quotations. A lot of times they were forced to cooperate with anti-Jewish relocation, but remember, anti-Semitism was common in Europe at the time, as well as locals to uncover the people that were hiding. You think of Anne Frank and her story about how her and her family, hid in an attic for so long before they were finally taken to the concentration camp and killed. However, in 1942, the Germans became more desperate in the war. Keep in mind, this is after the United States joins, they're now fighting Russia on one front and so forth. Nazi leaders came up with what they called the final solution at the Wannsee Conference. Basically, at that conference, they decided that the way to get rid of the Jewish population was their final solution was mass extermination of the entire population. At this point, all Jews under Nazi control were shipped to extermination camps, such as Auschwitz in Poland, where able-bodied men were worked to death, and others were killed on arrival. When you got there, they would send you in two lines, either straight to death or to work camp. Sometimes they would ask you questions if you had any skills. And if you were a carpenter, or if you were a farmer, if you were things of that, you may be able to help the Nazi cause, so they wouldn't kill you right away. But even those who weren't killed right away in the gas chambers or other means um, suffered with no food, barely any food at all, just enough to keep them working. If anything, many are going to starve to death, be brutally killed, tortured, and really just kind of sadistic means of how it was treated. I don't think it's possible out of all the videos and images and things that we see from the liberated camps afterwards. I don't believe it's possible to for our human minds to really comprehend the terrors that really happen behind those places, no matter how much you read about it, no matter how much you see it. I don't want to pretend to even be able to understand what these people were going through. So usually how it worked, it started in Germany, obviously, and as other people were captured and territories expanded, they would remove Jews from their house, tell them to bring only their, most valuable belongings. The reason because of that is because the Nazis wanted those valuable belongings. They were known for pulling out gold teeth and keeping watches and, things like that that could, be sold, melted down, whatever, worth something to the Nazi soldiers or the German war effort. So it was relocation for the most part. People were forced onto train, not given any food, water, not told where they were going, and forced into a ghetto for a time. While before the final solution, then after the Wannsee conference, and they came to that final solution, hoarded onto trains again to concentration camps or to work camps where the things we just talked about took place. So as we get away from Nazi Germany a little bit and look at the Allied side of things, the Anglican American or the British American technology, while the German and Japanese surprise and military might is going to win them very early victories, the Axis power is going to do very well on the early stages of the war. The economic and innovative power of the United States and Great Britain are going to eventually prevail or pull through. British code breakers created a machine that would break the code of the German Enigma machine. Basically, the Enigma machine was, it allowed them to send codes and break codes. So now, if they were able to listen to German broadcast or, pick up the Morse code, they would basically be able to figure out what the Germans were planning, when attacks were coming, so the United States and Great Britain and the other allies could plan better. American codebreakers also broke the Japanese codes and used this information to ambush the unbeaten Japanese fleet at Midway in 1942. Midway was a major battle in the Pacific Ocean during World War II. Also, new sonar and radar technology allowed British and American ships and soldiers to combat air raids and submarine warfare. You could now spot submarines, which made them sinkable, though very hard to do. And you would have better preparedness for air raids and where they were going and where they were going to attack to try and fight them off better. With these technological advances, the Allies were able to gain an upper hand in the long run and eventually hold off, drain the Axis powers of their supplies, their men, their military, and other things until eventually they start pushing back at D-Day on the Western Front, and Russia starts pushing back after the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. World War II, as we mentioned in earlier videos, is also going to be the first time atomic bombs are dropped. With the discoveries of Einstein had destroyed faith in objective knowledge, their approaches also bled over into other fields such as physics. Einstein's idea that energy and matter were interchangeable meant that matter could be turned into energy and vice versa. While the Germans took the head on this idea to discover converting matter to energy, the United States also was going to take an interest. After the war, and a lot of this is, was secret at the time, the United States is going to pardon so many Nazi scientists and actually invite them to the United States and have them work for the United States to further their technology and understanding of, physics, the human body, and some other things. So, the Manhattan Project was basically the project for putting together the atomic bombs. It was made all over the United States. People working on the atomic bomb didn't know what they were working on. It was assembled by just a few scientists. All the parts were brought in from different places, so much that the vice president didn't even know about the makings of the bomb until he actually became president. And eventually, Harry Truman made the decision to drop those bombs on Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to end the war without more American casualties. After the Battle of Stalingrad in Europe and midway in the Pacific, Allied forces began a steady 3-year push to end World War II. While early military success for Axis had startled the Allies, the innovations and technologies of the US and its allies overcame the setback. In addition to technology, the United States, besides Pearl Harbor, really was unscathed in their own national. All the fighting was fought in Europe. So that allowed their factories to constantly produce, while the Germans and all other powers in Europe were constantly being bombed and factories shut down. Because of that, Americans were able to produce a lot more. The Soviets wore down Germany and the US and Japan until they just could not continue fighting. They didn't have the resources. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki signaled the end of World War II and the beginning of a new nuclear US dominant world. While technology had been the key to Allied victory, World War II showed the terrible destructive power and technology that war could cause. Guns, planes, tanks, firebombing, and those atomic bombs decimated an entire generation of people from all different countries. The Holocaust had virtually eliminated European Jews and taken the lives of tens of millions of Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, disabled, and other people that Hitler saw as not real German. Large-scale migrations and refugees changed the demographics, and the former world powers of Britain, France, and Germany would lay in ruin for a very long time. Worse yet, the nuclear capability of the United States now gave human beings the ability to officially end all human life under the threat of nuclear war. I know that we hear about, Iran and North Korea and some of these other places that we worried about getting nuclear weapons. The United States has enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world like 30 times over. But with all that being said, it's important to understand how the war ended and how this technology is going to impact the future. The next event that we're going to end up talking about after we're completely done with World War II is the Cold War. That's going to be all about an arms race or militarism, building up weapons between the United States, who had a democracy, who had capitalism, and Russia, a communist, dictatorship that was seen as the exact opposite of American values. So even though the United States and Russia were allies for a large part of World War II, they are going to become enemies right afterwards because they disagree about how the land should be divided in Europe. They also very, very disagree when it comes to capitalism versus communism. So the ally that existed between those two countries during World War II is short-lived, and we're going to get into the Cold War, and starting in the 1950s and lasting all the way till the early 90s, where it's going to be a constant arms race and battle between the United States, democracy and capitalism, versus the USSR and communism. But that's for another time. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope this was helpful.